So good morning, everyone. Welcome to all of our school staff. Today we're going to be doing a workshop on trauma-based pedagogy. And first off, I'd just like to say hello. So my name's Carly. We also have Amelia, Lauren, and Cam here. And we're going to begin with the acknowledgement of country. So as we virtually gather here today, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land, the Ngunnawal people, and pay our respects to the elders of the past, present, and future, for they hold the memories, the traditions, the culture, and hopes of Aboriginal Australia. We must always remember that where we gather is, was, and always will be traditional Aboriginal land. So we're just going to go through the time frame here. The first half of this presentation is going to be presented in a lecture style format, and the second half will be more of a hands-on activity-based format to express your knowledge. There are 3 staff learning outcomes for today's presentation. They are first, understand what trauma is and how trauma affects the nervous system and developing brain. And this directly aligns with AITSL Standard 1.1, physical, social, and intellectual development and characteristics of students. The second learning outcome is identify the indicators of trauma, abnormal student behaviour, and how this presents in the classroom, which directly aligns with AITSL Standard 1.2, understand how students learn. Now, the final learning outcome is apply trauma-based practice in classroom settings, which directly aligns with AITSL Standard 1.5, differentiate teaching to meet the specific learning needs of students across the full range of abilities, and 4.3, manage challenging behaviour. So you've all been emailed a pre and post workshop Google form to complete. This is just going to help us identify if the staff learning outcomes have been achieved. Okay, so just to give us a bit of background, these are the statistics on the importance of trauma-informed practice. So due to the impact trauma has on childhood development, which we're going to cover in more detail over the next few slides, it is imperative that we are empathetic and supportive of those with traumatic history so that we are better prepared to assist their needs for health, growth, and achievement. So let's get an idea of how prevalent this trauma is in Australia. In these events, the child has been exposed to traumatic stresses such as abuse, neglect, or violence. So here you can see that 41% of adults, or around 6.5 million Aussies, have experienced at least one traumatic event before the age of 17. We can also see that approximately 1 in 6 Australian women and just over 1 in 10 Australian men experienced abuse before the age of 15. Those exposed to early trauma were 3.6 times more likely to have a mental health or substance use disorder. And we can see here that the most common traumatic events were witnessing domestic violence or experiencing physical or sexual assault. Okay, so again, what's the importance? Why are we doing trauma-informed practice? So it might appear that a professional learning module on trauma-based practice will only benefit those directly affected by trauma, but this is incorrect. All students and school staff can experience the benefits of trauma-informed classrooms. Some of these benefits include, but are not limited to, identifying traumatic behaviour, creating a consistent classroom structure, and developing and recognising the importance of self-care, resilience, empathy, positive relationships, and the regulation of emotions. Now, all these claims can be supported by psychological theories, and that's the development of positive, empathetic, and supportive relationships aligns with attachment theory, which examines the impact of early childhood bonding experiences. Quality relationships are, as stated by Howard and reflected in this professional learning module, the most important factor for healthy neural development and for every student's overall well-being. Studies have shown that those with traumatic histories who had at least one caring relationship with an adult exhibited resilience and ability to form relationships within a school setting. Hence why we have included an activity on building relationships within this workshop, which will be explored later on. With trauma-informed practice, we explore child growth and understand the impact neural development has on a child's ability. This is underpinned by child development theory and trauma theory. So out of instinct, a child with trauma history relies on the fast processing parts of the brain, and this can often lead to miscommunication and lack of emotional self-regulation. In our activities, trauma glasses and emotional self-regulation, We will address common teacher misconceptions and provide aid on how to better understand these students with traumatic backgrounds. These understandings directly link to 8th Standard 1.2, knowledge on research into how students learn and the implications for teaching. I'll just pass over to Millie now.
Thank you, Carly. So, to understand trauma, we need to understand the brain development at a neurobiological level. This will help us explain how trauma affects children's behaviour, learning, emotion, and the brain. A child's brain develops faster than at any other point in their life. A child understands and responds to experiences via their senses, sending signals to the brain determining their reactions and how they absorb information. A child's intellectual, social, and emotional construction of the brain are guided by the child's neurons developing vital synaptic connections. As neurons continuously fire, a child interacts with their world by creating patterns of neurological stimuli, also known as neural pathways. A pathway becomes stronger the more it is stimulated. However, less stimulation causes a pathway to reduce. The process called synaptic pruning is where the less stimulated pathways are expelled from the brain, whereas the strong ones are stored and continually strengthened. Pruning of connections and pathways is how the brain changes and develops with learning. When a child experiences intense trauma, their neural activity can be spontaneous and abnormal, hence causing unpredictable responses. A child who experiences trauma with constant heightened states and spontaneous outbursts will strengthen their unwanted or negative pathways, causing the brain to suffer at a vital development period, leading to emotional, behavioural, and cognitive limitations. SAMHSA states that individual trauma results from an event, series of events, or set of circumstances that are experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening. They have long-lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning, mental, physical, social, emotional, and spiritual health consequences. Typically, trauma can be any number of things. However, it is usually divided into two categories. The first is usually a single event that someone witnesses or experiences threat, serious injury, or death. The second category is linked to prolonged or repeated experiences of trauma, such as abuse and neglect. We are not traumatized by the situation itself, but more on how we experience that situation with the use of our internal coping mechanisms, external support, and broader factors that shape how we respond and react to experiences that shape our beliefs, thoughts, and the world around us. Origin states that by the age of 16, between half and 2/3 of young people have been exposed to at least one traumatic experience. It has been found that those exposed to at least 6 traumatic experiences throughout childhood can have a 20-year reduction in their lifespan. How are my students affected? A student being triggered can result in violent or angry outbursts, withdrawing from situations, or performing risk-taking behaviours. Students can also develop health issues relating to their traumatic past, such as post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, depression, or may even become suicidal. Students with traumatic pasts may have issues trusting teachers, parents, adults, and even their peers, resulting in difficulties when building relationships. Students from a traumatic background can have issues with memory, concentration, and learning, which directly impacts their ability to academically perform at school. More consequences include having trouble regulating their emotions, low self-care, intense feelings of anxiety, fear, and constant concerns for their safety. I will now pass on to Cam.
Thank you, Millie. So now to the fun part of the PL. I'm going to run into a little bit of information on building relationships, and then we'll go into a few activities. To achieve a positive classroom environment, there needs to be a solid, reciprocal teacher-student relationship where each individual's strengths and capacities are acknowledged and spaces of equal power are created. The quality of the student-teacher relationship is incredibly important to help trauma students to adapt to school life. Building relationships can be challenging when dealing with students who have experienced trauma, but with persistence and the implementation of certain strategies, this can help facilitate a rewiring of young people's brains. Howard also states that close, caring and supportive student-teacher relationships can result in enhanced neurological function and improved behavioural and overall well-being outcomes for the child. What are some specific strategies to help teachers build relationships? Before I get into the specific strategies and approaches a classroom teacher can implement, it is important to understand that support must also come from your colleagues and executives. It should never be expected that one teacher alone is responsible for the support of a complex student. Additionally, it is important to acknowledge that every student and every school context is different, so what works with some students might not work with others. Highly individualised approaches are necessary and should address the student's particular trauma background. Now I'm going to talk to you guys about mentoring firstly. So mentoring draws from Bandura's social learning theory, where people will learn behaviours in social settings by watching others, internalising what they see and basing their own behaviour on that interpretation. However, it is important to note that trauma can create a neurological state in the brain in which learning is compromised. Through my own work experiences at school, mentoring students has helped them build confidence, improve organisation, and develop more meaningful relationships with their peers and teachers. Usually this mentor is a significant other, whether that person be another staff member at the school or even a senior student. This person should not be the classroom teacher, but be willing to work collaboratively to support the classroom teacher. Howard suggests schools need to develop both proactive and reactive approaches to enhance the capacity for self-regulation, and assigning a mentor can assist during and after any crisis, helping the student focus on their emotional recovery. Looking for the gold in every student. Now, this is an approach that has profoundly impacted my relationships with challenging students. It is easy to throw in the towel and accept that a student won't succeed in your classroom, but research shows the benefits of building meaningful relationships are worth the effort. Even though the student is disruptive and shows little engagement in class tasks, you might find out that they are fantastic at drawing or are passionate about plants and animals. When you find out these little things, be sure to capitalise on it and use it to help build your relationship with that particular student. Finding common ground will often lead to you finding even more treasures that lay within. In my own practice, this strategy alone has helped me turn disengaged kids into willing learners. This approach draws from the social cognitive theory, the process of collecting and assessing information about others. This is an extension of Bandura's social learning theory. So we're going to get into our first activity related to relationships, and this is a bit of a relationship role play. So I'll give you guys all a chance to implement these strategies that I've just spoken about. On the board, you'll see the instructions to carry out a relationship role play. Ensure you split into groups of 2 to 3. If you have any questions regarding the instructions on the board, just yell out. We will meet back in about 15 minutes to watch and reflect upon everyone's role plays. How good were those role plays? Absolutely fantastic. Well done, everyone. We will now be moving on to another activity called trauma glasses, or another concept called trauma glasses. As discussed in the previous activity, building relationships with students that have faced trauma can sometimes seem like a lost cause. Behaviours that can derail a class in the blink of an eye are just the tip of the iceberg of what troubles you may face. We have learned that trauma has both short and long-term effects, and generally the more prolonged and severe the trauma, the greater the impact on the student's life. Youth exposed to trauma sometimes have issues regulating their emotions. Because of this, it is important to remember that these survival responses of aggression, disconnect, and withdrawal can end up being standard behaviours for how that particular student operates in the world. And it can be really difficult for some teachers to recognise these responses. All staff must take into account the trauma a student has faced, otherwise they run the risk of misunderstanding and mislabeling the core issues our students may be facing. Behaviours associated with trauma can be extremely detrimental to the student's success and their understanding of key topics and ideas. Additionally, the management of these behaviours can become frustrating for the class teacher. However, Once more insight has been gained in regards to these behaviours, it often makes sense in the context of that student's experiences. So I will introduce the first activity called trauma glasses. Now, this is where we put on our trauma glasses and consider the role trauma may be playing on how a student is behaving. We start to think and talk about students and their behaviours quite differently. Here I have filled out a table, and in the left column have put some common behaviours you might be witnessing in your classroom. In the right column, I am wearing my trauma glasses and have written down some reasons as to why that student may be displaying these behaviours, taking into account their traumatic pasts. Now, as you can see, I've handed out some tables that are blank in the right-hand column. Splitting into groups of 3, I want you to fill in the right column of your handout with alternative explanations or adjectives you might use to describe a particular student behaviour when you have your trauma glasses on. I will give everyone 6 minutes to complete this, and then we will share some of the responses. Absolutely fantastic responses, everyone. I will now hand it over to Lauren, and she will head into her activities.
Thank you, Cam. So, as we have discussed prior, students who have undergone trauma may have a number of underlying trauma triggers that us teachers are personally unaware of. The stimulus might not be frightening itself, however, it may indirectly be reminiscent of the earlier traumatic incident. For example, a piece of clothing may prompt recall of a previous traumatic experience for the student and thus cause an outburst in the classroom. When these outbursts occur, it is difficult for a student to self-regulate their emotions. However, it's important to note when school staff intervene, they need to appropriately time their response because a failure to do so may cause the situation to escalate even further, possibly putting other staff, students, and the individual themselves at risk. At least an hour of low stimulus activity is recommended for secondary students before attempting to question them on their outbursts. This time allows for the student to emotionally self-regulate. Questioning must take into consideration the student's background, if known, and be exercised in a calm and informing way by the teacher. To maintain healthy classroom behaviours, it is important to know your students, their backgrounds, and form strong relationships with them, as suggested by Cam. Background knowledge can help you recognise and eliminate any potential trauma triggers and differentiate your classroom content to best suit the needs of your students with trauma backgrounds, hopefully increasing classroom engagement. Putting on our trauma glasses can mitigate those naive staff perspectives and result in better handled school situations. Teachers should be aware of their students' certain coping mechanisms and assist students in overcoming their trauma. For this activity, common triggers for students are listed in the left, and your table group are to describe how you would alter your teaching practice accordingly. This activity relates to AITSL Standards 1.1 and 1.2 as you are going to demonstrate how students' intellectual development affects decision-making in your practice. Now, for the last activity. Students with trauma backgrounds more easily and frequently emotionally dysregulate. These dysregulations can account for behavioural outbursts. However, schools can help develop their students' capacities for emotional self-regulation and resilience through a combination of reactive and proactive approaches. What are these? Reactive approaches are flexible in nature and are the initial response to a behavioural outburst. Alternatively, proactive approaches are created for anticipated behavioural outbursts. They should be careful, informed, and individualised for students. When they are thoughtfully designed and implemented in schools effectively, the number of behavioural outbursts may reduce, but it's important to note that they may not cease due to the neurological consequences of trauma, already discussed prior by Millie in this professional learning module. Schools should still expect these behavioural outbursts and thus be trained to provide caring, evidence-based reactions to each and every situation. How we're doing for you today. We will now explore some of these proactive approaches discussed. The use of symbolism is effective, however simple, but it helps to create avert behavioural crises in the classroom. It is commonly used to identify a student's feelings or let the classroom teacher know that the student is going to exit the room. Some common signallings include tapping a desk, thumbs up or thumbs down, but we will be presenting to you 4 contemporary ideas based on research. The first is coloured emotion cards. These represent how students are feeling to help students articulate their feeling and aids the teacher to provide early intervention. For example, the cards may include happy, angry, and sad. Number 2, agreed upon objects. These can help students emotionally self-regulate by keeping their minds busy in order to calm down. For example, fiddling with a fiddle toy. Number 3, agreed upon hand gestures. These can signal to teachers that a student needs to leave the room in order to emotionally self-regulate. Can I see you all hold up an example of what one of these might look like for me right now? Nice work. And lastly, scaling emotion charts. These physical, quantitative, or qualitative measures can help teachers monitor students' emotional patterns throughout days and weeks. Additionally, they can provide evidence for teacher-student emotional discussions. The last activity will now be to create either a physical emotional scaling chart or coloured emotion cards to use with your students with our resources provided on your table groups. These communication strategies relate to AITSL Standards 4.3 and 1.5 as they help minimise challenging student behaviour and meet the learning needs of students with traumatic backgrounds. We will now allocate you 30 seconds to complete the post-workshop survey by pressing on the link on your computer. Thanks. Now, if you would like to engage further post-workshop, we have provided 4 of our favourite resources. Just simply click on the links provided. Lastly, these are the references we use throughout our PL to back up our statements. Thanks so much for your participation. Bye.